Hello there. This is the session called Lines on a Map, South Asian Stories. If only they were just lines on a map instead of enormously high walls that make it nearly impossible for any South Asian to cross any one of the borders that divide us. My name is Diaa Hadid. I'm the moderator of this session. And I'll just introduce one by one. Ameena Hussein has come from Sri Lanka. So she's endured two man-made crises. The first is extreme climate change, and the second was indigo. Samanth Subramanian has come in from London, and Pallavi Aiyar, who has come in from China, from where she's resident in Beijing. So all these authors are quite prolific. I got the chance to read some of their more recent books, and that's what I'm hoping to ask them about.
Yeah, I think they're saying that they can't hear us.
Okay, I'll just hand over the microphone to people who can speak more loudly than I can. Ameena, you're right at the end, so I'll start with you. You have a travelogue called Ibn Battuta in Sri Lanka. And I would love to hear from you why you used the conceit of Ibn Battuta, a medieval Muslim traveller, to tell stories about the island where you come from.
Thank you, Diaa. Thank you, everyone here. Thanks for coming to listen to us. And I just love being in Bangalore, so it's an honor to be here at the festival. So, Diaa, to answer your question, in 2014, I attended a conference called the Silk Routes Conference. And there was a name that kept coming up, and it was Ibn Battuta. And I had vaguely heard that he had come to Sri Lanka, but actually, I had not learnt anything much about him. So I decided, a lot of travel books start with, please forgive me, I don't mean to be obnoxious, but a white person going to a brown country, traveling around, going back, writing about, their impressions about it, and we take it as gospel truth. I wanted now to be a Sri Lankan traveling in my own country and finding out the trace of Ibn Battuta. And then I realized that a lot of people had just, oh yeah, he came, but they didn't know the story. So then I began to do research, I did travel research, and then that's why I actually wrote the book.
It might help. I don't know if everyone here has heard of Ibn Battuta. Could you just briefly introduce your main character, apart from Ameena Hussein, who's also a character in the book, but Ibn Battuta himself?
So Ibn Battuta was a 14th century Moroccan traveler who left Tangiers at the age of 21. And he traveled far more than Marco Polo. He traveled to more countries. He traveled for many more years. And he wrote actually about his travels. He wrote extensively about India. He stayed for 9 years in India. But his travels were written in Arabic. So it was only translated into a Western language, French, in the 18th century. And that was when the world woke up to that there was this travel book that spoke about things in great detail. If you read Marco Polo on Sri Lanka, he has a short paragraph. Ibn Battuta gives so much of detail, flora, fauna, food, and the landscape, the rulers, about every country that he went to.
Thank you. Samanth, I'm going to go to you for a moment. You are the author of many books. The one I read of yours it's an older one, but it was recently reissued, so yay. It's called Following Fish, Travels Around the Indian Coast. And I would love to know, first of all, why did you decide to make fish the object through which you decided to view India?
This is the most unsexy answer, which is that my editor suggested it. The short story is that I had written a few travel articles for magazines before, and an editor at Penguin got in touch and asked if I would like to write a book. And at that time, I was in my mid to late 20s, I think, and the books were still something that only other people wrote. I was obviously a deep reader of books, but I never thought I would produce one myself. So then she came to me and she said, Indians don't ever write travel books about their own country, and that's very similar to what you said. And I said, well, that's true. And then we went back and forth on ideas, and then she sent me an email, which I dug out recently to send on to her. Which she said, why don't you kind of write a book about the coastline and use fish as your theme? I said, well, that sounds great. Thank you for giving me the idea. And but the structure and so on came, with a little bit of research and thinking. But the idea was essentially to go to each of the 9 coastal states and talk to people on the coast, ostensibly about fish. But these books are never actually about fish. The book is about coastal practices and communities and religion and people's relationship with the ocean and the land and food and how food came about and religion and so on. So it's one of those ideas that you can kind of use as a key to unlock all these different doors and just peep around them to see what lies behind them.
For those of you who haven't read the book, and you should because it's such a fun book to read, Samanth starts the book by talking about how he was disgusted by fish for much of his life.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a very vegetarian household, and at some point I started eating a lot of meat, but I still couldn't just, fish was just like the furthest barrier. And if you're not used to it growing up, it just kind of, so I had to really, wrap my head around the fact that first of all, on this trip, I was going to eat a lot of fish. Fortunately for myself, it turned out to all be very good. There was fish in Calcutta, there was fish in Bangalore, there was fish in Kerala, and all of it was exquisite. But, as I said, it's not really about the eating, it's about the people who are making the food.
It was such a great book, thank you. Pallavi, you have written many books. The one that I read of yours was Orienting an Indian in Japan. And I would really like to hear from you the experience of writing about Asia through the prism of being Indian. Because as other people here have noted, normally we're reading travel books through the prism of white people who've come to visit, or people from the West who've come to visit. Obviously, your perspective is entirely different. Talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question, Diaa. The panelists over here mentioned how Indians or South Asians don't tend to really write books about their own country. But to be honest, Indians tend to even less write books about other countries. And Indians tend to even less write books about other Asian countries if they do not have significant Indian diasporas. And I have spent the last more than 20 years now reporting from and writing about being an Indian in China. I spent 7 years of my life between 2002 and 2009 living in Beijing. And my first book, Smoke and Mirrors, was called An Indian in China, I think, if I remember the subtitle. I then spent 4 years in Jakarta in Indonesia. And I also spent 4 years in Japan, in Tokyo. And I always call myself the lonely Indian foreign correspondent. And I was not lonely because I was particularly solitary in the sense of not having company, but I was lonely in the sense of being the only Indian foreign correspondent for most of this period. And indeed, as you mentioned, I mean, it is a wholly different experience being an Indian in these countries compared to being the kind of standard Western foreign correspondent in these countries. And that's really a natural outcome of the fact that what we observe and what we understand of the world that we see around us has very much to do with our implicit lenses, with our own norms against which we interpret what we are seeing. And I'll give you a sort of very simple example of what I mean by that. When I was first in China, so this is a slightly dated example, but say in 2005, 2006, I would be with other foreign correspondents, I don't know, having a drink drink in Beijing, looking outside the window and looking at the kind of traffic that was flowing, say, down the Third Ring Road or one of their main avenues. And invariably, the Western foreign correspondent I'd be with, whether they were from Germany or the US or Australia, would sort of complain about, oh my God, look at the crazy traffic, and these Chinese don't know how to drive, and they're always switching lanes, and it's just completely chaotic. And then I would have an Indian visitor visiting me from India, and virtually the first thing they would say as they looked out of the window as we drove in was, oh my God, the Chinese drive in such an orderly way. It's almost like they're like robotically programmed. How is it that there's no kind of stray cows wandering around, and where's the honking? So we were seeing exactly the same thing. We were seeing the traffic in Beijing, but I was seeing something different and they were seeing something different. And the fact that you have such few Indian foreign correspondents in the world means that most of the world, including India itself, really learned about, at the time, China of the crazy traffic rather than China of the no honking and orderly driving.
Thank you. I am sheepishly empathizing because I am a foreign correspondent, and that was probably me looking out the window. I also noticed that when you wrote about Japan, and Pallavi, we were chatting before about some of the things that you might have seen that other people might not have seen in the same way, and one of them was about caste in Japan. And I'm really wondering, like, could you just talk us through, when non-Indians are reading your books, what do they remark to you about them? Like, I'm curious to see, it's like, how does someone who is not from here see the way you write?
I think it's actually been quite perspective expanding for them. The main way that I know how they see it is from reviews that are left on Goodreads and Amazon. And very often they kind of talk about the fact that this was the first time they were looking at things in that particular way. So, you know, for example, I don't know, like toilet cleaners, or before the Olympic Games in Beijing in 2008, there was lots written about the horrible toilets in Beijing, and also the new toilets that were being built. And when the new toilets were sort of talked about, it was always like, oh, this horrible authoritarian government that is kind of building these fancy new toilets to fool the rest of the world about how terrible the real toilets are. That was essentially the narrative that you would have found, for example, in the New York Times. And my immediate interest was on the toilet cleaners, right? Like, I wanted to know about, like, how does caste function? How do people see them? How do they see themselves? This was like, again, like a long time ago, and already they had things like simple protective clothing, like gloves, uniforms. And I sort of began to realize very much that in China, for example, being a toilet cleaner was much more like an adjective, sort of describing what somebody did, whereas in India, it was more akin to a noun, almost kind of describing who they were. But, just the fact that, and then I ended up looking into the history of toilet cleaners and realizing that in the 1960s, there was a very famous toilet cleaner called Liu Shashang, who had been elevated in communist propaganda as a kind of model worker, and reams of decades of Chinese school children were basically exhorted to learn from this particular toilet cleaner. So they'd grown up sort of as one of their heroes being a toilet cleaner, and everybody knew the story of this heroic communist toilet cleaner who was carrying people's refuse on his head till the very last moment in service of the communist revolution. Amazing. But it was very rare that a Western foreign correspondent would have dug that story up or, gone that way. It was more about authoritarian Chinese government, fake fancy toilets, the idea of hiding something from the rest of the world. So you immediately go to different places. I do think that there's an audience for it because my books have been published in other parts of the world. And the reaction often has been, wow, we just haven't heard this kind of perspective before. Yeah.
Thank you. Ameena, there's something that I'm really curious about in your writing. Again, if you haven't read Ameena's book, you really should crack it open. It just reinterprets Sri Lanka for you through like this totally different prism. But you almost tried to do the impossible, which was cover Ibn Battuta as a woman. And while I would argue being female in South Asia is rarely the obstacle that people think it might be, except for safety, yours was a different problem. I would love you to talk through the audience about your chief obstacle in writing this book.
So when I began the research, I realized I would have to do a trip around the parts that Ibn Battuta went. And I'm a vagrant. I love to get in a car and I love to go on trips. So I knew I needed, I'm not sure if this is the correct word, but like a wali, like a guardian, a Muslim guardian. And I asked my husband.
A mahram.
A mahram, yeah, sorry, thank you for the word. And I asked my husband, who is not a Muslim, will you drive me around? And he's also ever ready for a jaunt. He said, okay. So the ironic thing is, to look for Ibn Battuta, we had to go to many mosques. And every time, by the time I heard, the fifth time I heard, you have to go to the mosque, my heart would sink because I knew exactly how this would play out. I would go in, so Sam, my husband, would be in the car. I would go in, and the minute they saw this polluting female, they would say, shoo, shoo, shoo. And I would then respond in a very un-Muslim woman way by saying, wait, I want to talk to you. Now, Muslim women generally don't want to talk to Muslim men. So then that would take them aback. And I would then hit them with, do you know Ibn Battuta? Like as if he's a relative or someone who is contemporary, which really threw them off. And then I would come out with my spiel, 14th century Moroccan traveler, supposed to have come to Ratnapura. Do you know anything about him? And they got so enthralled with my story that they forgot I was a woman, and then they would actually try to help me. But this was something that played out over and over again. Sometimes I would have to send my mahram in front. If I thought the mosque was very, forbidding, I would send him in front to talk to some senior member instead of a sweeper who would just not even want to listen to me. So these were, and in almost every place I went to, I had to go to a mosque. But the beauty of Sri Lanka, I realized, is they love a good story. And they get told, then they forget who you are. They forget your hair is not covered properly. Sometimes I have gone in a shameful dress, right? Long, but still it's a dress. And with a diaphanous scarf, which was stuck in the car. And because I'd forgotten to pack properly. But once I started the story, the spiel, and then I would lecture them on how they don't know their Muslim heritage. That always was a winner, because then they would be penitent, and then they would really try to help me. But it was something, if you were a man, and Sam wasn't even a Muslim, if you were a man saying, I'm coming to do research on anything Islamic in Sri Lanka, in a Sri Lankan space, a mosque, a community, a Muslim community, they wouldn't even ask a question. They would immediately open themselves. They would immediately be interested to talk. So these were things I had to navigate over and over and over again. And then it becomes like, okay, so this is what I have to do. And you just get prepared to do it.
You persisted, and through the book, my heart was falling every time you had to visit a mosque as well. Why did you keep going? Like, why did you keep going and going to these mosques? And again, full disclosure, we are both Muslim women, we are both married to non-Muslim men, and both of us had the experience of like having to navigate mosques in our lifetime. Why did you keep going?
Because that was where, so I realized, it was such a revealing moment for me when I realized that Islam had come through the traders to Sri Lanka, but it was a Sufi Islam. And Ibn Battuta in the 14th century was a hive of Muslim trade in our part of the world. It was the Silk Route, and the Muslims were ruling the seas, as you would say. A lot of them died in our spaces. I don't know, it must be the same in the coastal regions of India. A lot of them died, And what happened was, whether they were traders or preachers or just, wandering bodies, shrines were constructed over them and a mosque was built. And a lot of them came to do pilgrimage to climb Adam's Peak. I think a lot of Sri Lankan Muslims are completely unaware. We have this mountain called Adam's Peak, or Sri Pada in the way Sri Lanka calls it. And it's a holy mountain for all 4 religions. For Hindus, it is the footprint of Shiva. For Buddhists, it's the footprint of Lord Buddha. For Muslims, it's the footprint of Adam. And for Christians, it's the footprint of St. George, I think. Yeah. So, and people have been trekking this route for centuries. And many of them died. They could not navigate and go back to their homes. So mosques arose, a shrine happened, people would go and pray at these shrines. So I wanted to know the stories about these shrines. Where did they come from? Did the custodians know the whole story?
Thank you. Samanth, I wanted to ask you about your book. I have to say my favorite was the toddy houses in Kerala, because that just sounded delicious. How was it to write that book, in the sense of, did you start with a lot of material from the coast and then just have to whittle it down to like your best stories? Was it that you had decided in advance where you would go and how you would do it? Because your book is quite remarkable in the sense of, it's not, as you said, it's not really about fish, but it really covers something that's quite different in every part of these coastal regions. I've never learnt so much about Hilsa in my life. Thank you. Tell us more about it.
Well, so when I was writing this book or researching it, I had a job, a full-time job. I was a writer at Mint, the business newspaper in New Delhi. And so I couldn't really take time out and travel around the coast from east to west in one long sweep, as I would have liked to do. So what I had to think about was sort of the structure of the book and what themes I would address. And obviously, if you have to kind of travel in an episodic way, kind of travel out of Delhi, do your research, come back, then do it again 2 or 3 months later somewhere else, you have to really know well in advance what you're going for. And so a lot of this involved just research done before the trip, talking to people to figure out what I would find when I get there, who I should talk to, set up my interviews in advance. So for example, in Gujarat, the essay I write is about the ancient art of boat building wooden fishing boats. And I'd kind of heard from an academic who specializes in this, that there's a myth that these boats are built exactly the same way as they were 500 years ago. That they use the same implements and they don't use modern tools, and the design is exactly the same. And so the academic who I met in Delhi told me, saying, people keep saying this, but I think it's wrong. Like, it's just impossible that these communities continue to live the way they did, because it's not efficient for them. Ultimately, this is about their livelihood, and they would do anything to improve it and to make sure that they get by. So she said, why don't you go and write about that? So then she gave me some contacts, and I lined those interviews up in advance. Sometimes I had to be a little sneaky. So once the chapter that's set in Andhra Pradesh, actually comes from Hyderabad, and it's about the famous fish treatment for asthma, so which involves swallowing a small live fish. And this is a huge public event every summer, 2 to 3 days in a big ground, and people come from all over the country. They used to run special trains to Hyderabad from places like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, just so the ailing asthmatics could go and get their relief. And so I really genuinely wanted to write about this because I am an asthmatic, and I've been hearing about this for like 35 years. But once again, because of my very vegetarian household, this was not the remedy that I was going to ever take as a kid. So I wanted to write about this, and I went to my editor at the newspaper, and I said, listen, I really want to, maybe I should go and cover this for the newspaper. So he looked at me very quizzically, and he said, this is not a business story. We are a business newspaper. What's going on? And so then I had to kind of confess that, like, oh, look, I'm actually writing a book and all this stuff. So he was very sweet. He said, well, okay, you should go. You should write, do a 3-part series. I'll give you some contacts. And it turned out, coincidentally, that his father was, until he passed away, the preeminent rationalist in Hyderabad and had been opposing this fish treatment for years on the grounds of a lack of hygiene and the fact that it was pure superstition and people were just getting taken for a ride. So it was just a complete coincidence. But if I hadn't come clean to my editor, he would never have set me up as his father. So, you had to kind of do these things. So the reason the book is the way it is because I had to keep making these trips out and back, and you had to go and focus on a very specific story, talk to a very specific set of people, and then fly right back for my day job.
I was reading your essay about Bangalore, and it just sounded like you were sweating the whole way through it in case you really didn't get to eat a Mangalorean fish curry at the end. Pallavi, you have now written another book. Is it also about travelling? Just tell us a bit about what you've now just put out in the world, the book that you've now given birth to.
I'm actually super excited because I got the very first copy of my new book yesterday. So it's really hot off the press, and I'm very excited that it's here in Bangalore. The first time I'm ever seeing it in a bookstore is here at the Atagalata bookstore in Bangalore. It's called Travels in the Other Place, Pursuing the Self in 8 Acts. And I suppose it arose from the fact that, as we've been talking, I've been quite a peripatetic. I've been wandering around the world for the last 25 years. I've lived in maybe 8 countries in the last 25 years. And I feel that through all of these travels, I've learned something of the art of traveling well. And then in 2023, I had a really awful year, an annus horribilis, like one of those years, where not great things happened. I got a shock breast cancer diagnosis at the age of 46, and I very suddenly lost my mum in a kind of traumatic way. Like we were speaking on the phone one evening and making plans to meet a couple of months down the road, and then the next morning the phone rings and the person on the other end says that she's gone. So it really felt like being run over by a truck. But I also began to think about these other kinds of journeys that every human being takes in their lives, trips to what, Susan Sontag very famously said that we all have 2 passports in this life, a passport to the kingdom of the well and a passport to the kingdom of the sick. And at some point, whether we like it or not, we switch those passports. And so having gone through this experience of switching the passports and traveling through this kind of new terrain of cancer and learning its language and, sort of meeting both the potholes and, the highs and sort of the interesting corners of it. And similarly doing that with grief, having lost my mother, I began to think about how I could apply some of the things I learned about having been a good traveler in the sense of space, traveling from one place to another, and sort of thinking about how I could apply those to being a good traveler in terms of time, because we don't just travel through space, we also travel through time, through the decades. And so this book is kind of set across the decades from the 1980s to the present day. And it begins with meeting me in New Delhi as a little girl curled up on my sofa, learning to travel through books, through Enid Blyton, like many Indians really did. And each chapter is focused on a particular kind of travel. So traveling through books, traveling through illness, traveling through new languages, traveling through what Gen Z, I call it pedagogy, but it's really about learning to treat my children who are Gen Z and Gen Alpha, I believe. And I sort of treat them as almost as though traveling in a new country and learning their topography and their language. Traveling through grief and traveling with an Indian passport, which is its own particular world of travel. So that was the idea, and that's the other places that I talk about in the title, Travels in the Other Place.
Thank you. Ameena, I'm wondering, do you have another travel book in you?
A lot of people have asked, because when I published Ibn Battuta in Sri Lanka, people learned not only about Ibn Battuta, but they learned about the long Muslim community history in Sri Lanka. And I have to tell you, the book came out in 2020 November. In 2019 April, we had this terrible Easter bombing that was perpetrated by Muslim extremists. And I mean, even I was just shocked. I had to rewrite my entire afterword in the light of that. So the book was also a message that the Muslims of Sri Lanka did not come yesterday. They have been there for more than 1,000 years. And this book depicts that. The other thing it shows is also the history. Sri Lankans don't know their history very much. And Ibn Battuta talks about the kings he met. He talks about what people wore. He talks about the jewels. He talks about the food that they ate. It was utterly revealing and humiliating also for me as a Sri Lankan to read his travels to learn about my country. So now a lot of people, we've had, as an island, we've had tons of visitors come to Sri Lanka. The most famous is Marco Polo, but he's actually the least interesting for me. So I have to look for some more interesting person because, I do love to travel. I do love to get about the country. So, but I haven't found him or her yet.
Thank you. Samanth, I'm going to ask you the same question. Knowing that you've just recently published a book about undersea cables, which is a journey, but talk to me, like if you had it in you to write another book about travelling, where would it be? Where would you go?
I think except for one book, I think all my books are travel books in one sense. I wrote, my second book was a book about the Sri Lankan Civil War. It involved living in Sri Lanka for slightly more than a year, but traveling around the country, and the sense of these places of Jaffna and of Vavuniya and so on as a place, the sense of place is very present in the book. The book about undersea cables, it's called The Web Beneath the Waves, which will release in India next year, early next year, is also a travel book. In fact, it was written inspired by an old Neil Stephenson essay about undersea cables that was written in the 90s. And he, in that essay, called himself a hacker tourist and went around the world kind of looking at landing stations and the nascent internet and the hardware that was coming up for it. And I thought, well, look, first of all, that sounds like an extremely fun thing to do. But then secondly, also, the internet has changed a lot in the last 25 years, and I wanted to know, well, what's changed? So I pitched this book essentially as an update on that hacker tourist genre, which meant that I got to go to places like Tonga and the Ivory Coast and Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, Madrid, California, all on the publisher's dime, which is like a nice change. But it is also, I think, like imbued with a sense of place, because these are all, very local kind of phenomena that are operating also simultaneously at a global level. And most of the writing I do, I think, is of that kind. I'm a long-form magazine journalist by trade, and almost all of my articles deal with going to a particular place and trying to capture a sense of the place and the people who live there, which you could argue is a kind of travel journalism and a travelogue every time I write one.
Absolutely. I've just realised I haven't opened up to questions. We've got 7.5 minutes. Okay, let me start. You, then you. Let me just,
Hi, I'm Chavi, and first of all, congratulations to all four of you for such an engaging session. What I believe as a reader is that my balance of perception for the context of the book depends on how balanced the author's words are. So when we talk about South Asian culture, so it is framed by a lot of crises in the past or even in the present, like partition, wars, immigration, maybe tsunami, all such ecological and man-made factors. But in parallel, there is a lot of rich everyday culture as well. So how do you balance to bring that rich everyday culture in your books along with the crisis of the past? How do you balance these two elements when you write about travel or any place?
I mean, that is actually the challenge, right? I mean, it's about bringing complexity to your writing and to kind of refuse easy answers, which can be very hard to do because, you also have to write a book, and often the temptation is to kind of go into broad brushstrokes, because if you keep saying but, it almost sounds like you don't have a spine and you're not actually making a kind of argument. But that is also why I think all of us have kind of gravitated towards towards this form of writing, which allows you a little bit of ambiguity and complexity. It's not the kind of op-ed writing where you have to kind of take a very, like one stance and kind of keep a lot of the messy context out of it. And travel writing, at least if you're doing it in a long-form way, the whole point is to be able to bring out different strands, historical strands, sociological strands, cultural strands, and also I think to be very open about your own subjectivity, that ultimately this is you who's writing it, and so you bring your own limitations to that. I was talking earlier about your internal lenses. For me, it's very clear to kind of make those internal lenses apparent to the reader, you know, rather than obfuscating them and pretending to some kind of objective view. So I am very much writing as who I am, and I'm very aware that, you know, the person who I am, my background, my class, my caste, my nationality, my gender, all of those things are in many ways shaping the truth of what I'm seeing.
Did you guys want to answer as well?
Yeah, that's a very good answer.
I just want to say a little bit on, to follow what Pallavi said, is that what she said about class and access also. So yes, I was limited as a woman, but because I had my own vehicle, I think when the people saw me, they understood that I came from a different class of people. They were also more open to speaking with me. But Ibn Battuta taught me how not to do research. He was so judgmental. He was so opinionated. He said he knew he loved women, and he had an opinion on every country, the women he went to. He said the best women are the fattest women, and they are found in the Berber mountains. And then he did not like any other kind of woman, but he must have liked the Maldivian women. He married 4 times.
He would have been cancelled today.
There was another, yes, please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the engaging talk. Am I allowed to ask 2 questions or just one?
One.
Go for it. Oh, do you want one?
I'll take it.
Okay. So, as Ms. Hussein mentioned, the misogyny she faced when she went to the mosques. I was just wondering for all of you, what are the challenges you face? So, for Ms. Hussein and Mr. Subramanian, it's traveling within their own countries versus Ms. Aiyar going to another country. So what were the challenges faced? And can I also sneak in my second question? Sorry, I'm just being cheeky here. So Ms. Hadid, I'm assuming you're Lebanese? Yes. So that reminded me, do any of you have any interests or any plans in the future to do like a travel write-up in the Middle East? Thank you.
Very quickly, because we're sort of running out of time, I have to say that I have not spent much time reporting on or traveling around India, which I imagine would bring its own set of challenges. And most of the places where I've been active as a foreign correspondent has been in East Asia, so China and Japan, both of which, Spain as well, and Belgium. And all of these places have been, you know, reasonably easy from the sort of safety point of view. And I haven't faced too many challenges, I think, you know, inherent in my being a woman. The occasional times when I've been sort of questioned about it or made to feel awkward has usually been when I'm interacting with the Indian diaspora in these places. So I've met like Indian uncles in Beijing who I'm trying to interview, and they keep saying to me like, but what are you doing here, beta? And I would be like, but I'm a journalist. I'm here to interview you about, you know, something.
No,
and
but
they'd
what
be
are you
like,
actually
no,
doing?
but what are you doing here? And this would go on and on until the penny would drop, that what they're actually asking me is why am I not in India? Who is like there to account for me? Who is tethering me? And then I would finally kind of give in and say, my husband, I'm here with my husband. At which point everything made sense, you know, and it was like, to aisa bolna tha, no? And then they would start talking. So I have met that, but really it's been more with the Indian diaspora than in the countries that I've been in.
Sorry, I will quickly, you asked a question about am I going to write about the Middle East? Yeah. Are any of you guys going to write about the Middle East? I wrote about it for 20 years as a journalist. And one day when I quit journalism, I'll write a proper book. But yeah, this is delightful. I just want to be in South Asia for the next few years. I love it here.
One question from your
We've
work.
got 36 seconds left, so hurry.
You've all traveled a lot. One thing which we should do on our next trip and one thing we shouldn't do on our vacations.
I would say the one thing that you definitely should do is talk to people, just like across the board. You know, this is also part of it's also partly the answer to the question raised earlier about the balance between the everyday and the global or the universal or the national. Those narratives are abstract. The narrative of partition, 80 years on is like an abstract thing. But what it really means in the day-to-day, you only know by finding out and talking to people. And I think like those conversations are irreplaceable. They're better than eating the food. They're better than traveling elsewhere, whatever. You just have to talk to people.
All right, and I'm going to jump in and interrupt and say the other thing I would suggest is just put down your bloody phone. No one needs another selfie. You see so much more when you're not looking through the prism of a camera at a new place.